The woods of eastern Tennessee have always had a way of swallowing secrets. The air hangs heavy there, thick with rot, pine, and things best left unspoken. On a cold morning in late October, the mist rolled down from the ridge and lingered near the old logging trail, where a hunter named Clyde Mercer found her. A girl, barefoot, trembling, and silent as stone. Her skin was pale as frost, her hair matted with mud, and when she lifted her face toward him, Clyde swore the light bent in her eyes. He couldn't tell if they were gray, blue, or something not meant for human sight. They said later she couldn't have been more than 14, though her stare carried the weight of centuries. No one in town knew her. No school records, no family, no name. She didn't speak, not even when they brought her into the sheriff's office. She just sat by the window, watching her own reflection, as if she were waiting for it to move on its own. By nightfall, the sheriff's deputy drove out to where she'd been found, a mile past the ridge, through blackberry thorns and creek mud, until he came upon a cabin half collapsed beneath the weight of years. No smoke, no sound. But inside, every inch of the walls was lined with family portraits, faces that all looked like hers. Same mouth. Same hair. Same impossible eyes. And though the cabin was empty, the air still carried the faintest hum, like a whisper caught between worlds. Something had lived there long before her, and perhaps, something still did. The morning had barely broken when Clyde Mercer stepped into the woods with his rifle slung over his shoulder, breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. The forest in eastern Tennessee was always eerily quiet after the first frost, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until you could hear your own heartbeat. He'd hunted these woods all his life, knew every twisted oak and every bend in the creek, but that morning something felt wrong, the kind of wrong that makes you stop mid-step without knowing why. The air smelled different, heavy with decay and damp earth, as though the ground itself was hiding something beneath its skin. He first noticed her tracks near the edge of the hollow, small, barefoot prints pressed deep into the mud, circling in strange, overlapping loops as if she had been walking in confusion or trying to find her way out and failing. Clyde followed them for nearly half a mile until he reached a clearing where the mist hung thick and low, turning the trees into ghostly shapes. That's where he saw her. A girl, standing perfectly still among the reeds, staring at nothing. Her dress was torn, clinging to her like it hadn't been washed in months, and her feet were raw from the cold ground. She didn't flinch when he called out. Didn't even blink. Just stood there, her arms hanging limply by her sides, her hair tangled and streaked with dirt. When she finally looked up, Clyde felt something twist inside him, not fear exactly, but something deeper, older. Her eyes didn't seem right. In the pale morning light, they shimmered like they had no true color at all, flickering between silver, gray, and a shade of blue that seemed to move on its own. For a moment he thought it was a trick of the fog, until she stepped closer and the reflection of the forest appeared inside her pupils, trees bending, light bending, as if her eyes were made of water. He couldn't hold her gaze for long. She didn't speak when he asked her name or where she'd come from. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, just a faint trembling breath, like a whisper that never formed words. When he tried to lead her toward his truck, she followed without protest, but every few steps she'd stop and look back toward the woods, eyes wide, as if something were still watching her from the trees. Clyde didn't see anything there, but he could feel it too, that unseen weight, that presence. He would later tell the sheriff that she looked less like someone who had been lost and more like someone who had finally escaped. The trail leading from where the girl had been found twisted deeper into the woods, narrowing into a path few had walked in decades. Sheriff Amos Dillard and his deputy followed it that same evening, guided only by the pale beam of a flashlight and the faintest scent of smoke that seemed to come and go with the wind. The locals had whispered for years about families living out past the ridge, the kind that didn't mix with townfolk, the kind that preferred to be forgotten. By the time the men reached the end of the trail, the woods had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the cicadas had gone still. There, tucked between two dying maples, they saw it, a cabin that seemed to have grown out of the ground itself. The structure was rotting, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. The windows were covered in grime so thick they reflected no light, and the door hung crooked on one hinge. No smoke rose from the chimney. The place had the feel of something long abandoned, but when the sheriff stepped inside, the air was warm, as if someone had just left. A kettle sat blackened on the stove, a single wooden chair lay overturned, and a Bible with no cover rested open on the table, its pages warped by dampness. What unsettled them most were the walls. Every inch of the cabin's interior was covered in photographs, old, faded, curling at the corners, nailed directly into the wood. They showed faces that all shared a resemblance: men, women, and children with the same pale complexion and hollow eyes, standing in front of the same cabin that now surrounded them. Some of the photos looked decades old, others, impossibly new. The sheriff ran his hand along the wall, tracing one photograph where a young woman stood barefoot in the field, her eyes the same strange, shifting hue as the girl's. Written beneath it in a trembling hand was a date, 1956. There were no records in the county for anyone matching that name or family. The mailbox outside had no address, no numbers, and when they radioed the town clerk, she confirmed what they already feared: there was no property listed in that part of the forest at all. The cabin didn't exist on paper. It was as if the land had swallowed it whole and left only the memory of those who'd lived there. Before leaving, the deputy thought he heard a floorboard creak behind the backroom door. But when he pushed it open, the room was empty, save for a child's wooden toy lying in the corner, carved in the shape of an eye. When the girl was brought into town, the sheriff's first step was to find out who she was. In small places like Waycross Hollow, everyone knew everyone, and the absence of a familiar face was enough to stir unease. Yet no one had ever seen her before. She didn't appear in any school photographs, church rosters, or medical logs. The local doctor confirmed she had no record of vaccinations, no history of visits, nothing to show she had ever existed in their system. Even the census from the last 20 years turned up blank for anyone her age living within 30 miles. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air. The sheriff, now uneasy, sent his deputy to the county clerk's office in search of a birth certificate. They combed through drawers filled with yellowed documents and brittle pages that smelled of dust and mildew. The clerk, an elderly woman who had kept those records for nearly half a century, frowned as she flipped through the ledgers. There was nothing, no record of her name, no record of her parents, and no matching entries for a child born within the right time frame. Then the deputy noticed something strange. Whole years were missing from the archives. Not misplaced, not mislabeled, simply gone. The pages jumped from 1992 to 1997, as though someone had neatly removed every trace of what came in between. The clerk grew pale as she recalled how her predecessor, a quiet man named Harlan Brooks, had vanished without notice back in the late 90s. He'd been responsible for maintaining those very records. Some said he'd run off to Kentucky. Others whispered he'd gone mad, claiming he'd seen things in the birth ledgers that didn't belong to this world. Whatever the truth, his disappearance had never been investigated deeply in those days. Folks didn't ask too many questions about things that made their skin crawl. When the sheriff compared the remaining documents, he noticed odd patterns: multiple births with the same surnames recurring over generations, sometimes overlapping, sometimes repeating. A few entries had been struck out in red ink, with the words void scrawled beside them. He asked the clerk what that meant, and she shook her head, whispering that some families in the hills didn't take kindly to being recorded. Some lived and died without ever stepping into town. Back at the station, the girl sat in the corner, humming softly to herself, tracing invisible shapes on the fogged window. The sheriff watched her reflection and wondered if she somehow belonged to those missing years, a remnant of something the records were never meant to remember. Word of the strange girl spread quickly through Waycross Hollow, whispered from porch to porch, carried in the low hum of gossip that never truly slept. Some said she was a runaway. Others claimed she was a spirit born from the woods themselves. But when the sheriff mentioned her to the older folks, the ones who had lived long enough to remember when the town was smaller and the mountains darker, their faces changed. They didn't ask questions. They just went quiet, as if the name itself had weight. It was an old woman named Alma Reed who finally spoke, her voice brittle with age and warning. She said the girl didn't come from nowhere. She came from the hollow. Alma's house sat at the edge of the tree line, cluttered with relics and yellowed photographs. She told the sheriff about a family that once lived deep beyond the creek, long before the roads were paved or the county had maps. They were known only as the Marrows, a name whispered but never written down. Folks said they kept to themselves, never trading with town, never sending their children to school. They lived off the land and off each other. 4 generations, they stayed hidden, bound by an old belief that their blood carried a sacred gift. A gift that came from keeping the line pure. As Alma spoke, her eyes darted toward the window, afraid of being overheard. She said that when she was a girl, her father warned her never to wander past the 3rd ridge, where the trees grew twisted and the air always smelled like iron. There were nights, she said, when strange cries echoed through the hollows, sounds that weren't quite human. And sometimes, if you looked close enough, you'd see pale faces watching from the shadows, faces that looked too similar to each other. That was the Marrow family's land, and no one who went there ever came back the same. The sheriff listened, unsure whether to believe her, until Alma showed him a faded newspaper clipping tucked inside a Bible. It dated back to 1931 and told of a family fire in the same woods, a farmhouse reduced to ash, no survivors found. Yet beside the headline was a photograph of a young girl with eyes unlike any others, light shifting within them like mercury. The name beneath it was unreadable, the ink long since smeared, but the resemblance to the girl in his custody was undeniable. Alma placed her trembling hand over the photo and said softly that the Marrow bloodline was never extinguished. It just went deeper underground, waiting to be seen again. The photograph appeared days after the sheriff's visit to Alma Reed, carried into the station by a local historian named Daniel Haskins. He'd heard about the strange discovery in the woods and thought he might help trace the girl's origins through old family archives. Haskins had spent years cataloging forgotten records from Tennessee's mountain towns, but even he admitted that certain families simply vanished from history, their names erased as though time itself had swallowed them whole. When he laid the photograph on the sheriff's desk, both men went silent. It was sepia-toned, curled at the edges, and faintly water-stained, yet the image was unmistakably clear. It showed a young woman standing in front of the same cabin the deputies had found in the woods. Her dress was plain, her posture rigid, and her face expressionless. But her eyes, those same eerie, light-bending eyes, stared straight into the camera, capturing something that felt alive. The back of the photo bore a handwritten note, faded but legible, Clara M., 1956. Haskins explained that he'd found it in a box of unsorted church donations from an estate sale years ago. No one had claimed it, and he'd assumed it was just another relic from an unremarkable rural family. But seeing the sheriff's expression now, he knew better. The resemblance between the woman in the photo and the silent girl found in the woods was uncanny, every detail aligned. The same bone structure, the same tangled hair, even the faint scar above her left eyebrow. They could have been sisters or mother and daughter, but the timeline didn't fit. The woman in the photograph looked no older than 20 when it was taken, nearly 70 years earlier. The sheriff took the picture to the local paper archives, hoping to cross-reference the name, but no record of a Clara M. existed in any regional census, obituary, or church registry. It was as if she'd never been born. Yet several photographs taken decades apart began to surface, each featuring a woman with identical features, appearing unchanged by time, always in the same part of the mountains. One dated back to 1908. Another from 1979. Every version of her carried the same hollow gaze, the same impossible eyes that seemed to shimmer even in the dull tint of black and white film. Rumors spread fast, some calling it a family inheritance, others something far darker. The townsfolk whispered that the girl wasn't new at all, that she was a reflection of the woman who'd lived and died generations ago, a fragment of the same cursed blood still walking, unchanged by the passing of years. And though no one could prove it, every person who looked into that photograph swore they saw the eyes shift, just slightly, as if watching them back. When the doctor at the county clinic first examined the girl, he expected to find signs of malnutrition, neglect, maybe trauma from living in isolation. What he found instead left him speechless. She was silent throughout the examination, watching every movement with those strange, shifting eyes that made the fluorescent lights above flicker in uneven rhythm. Her pulse was steady, her breathing calm, but her gaze was unsettling, unbroken, as though she was studying him rather than the other way around. When he shined a light into her pupils, the reflection wasn't normal. Instead of contracting like a human eye should, they seemed to absorb the light, almost swallowing it whole, and then glint back with a silvery sheen. He blinked, thinking it a trick of fatigue, Yet every test he ran only deepened the unease creeping through him. Her blood work came back first. The results were labeled inconclusive. Certain proteins didn't match any known genetic markers, and there were anomalies in her hemoglobin count that no existing medical literature could explain. It was as if her blood had adapted differently, thicker, almost metallic in color when exposed to air, with a faint shimmer that shouldn't have been possible. Her DNA sequence, when run through the lab's aging equipment, came back corrupted 3 separate times. The machine seemed unable to process it fully, like it was trying to read something that wasn't meant to be decoded. The doctor, thinking perhaps there had been contamination, ordered a new sample under strict conditions. But the second test produced the same result. The girl sat still through it all, never flinching, never blinking, her eyes tracking the motion of his hands. When he stepped back, she finally whispered something, just one word, low and hollow, though he couldn't be sure if it was English or something older. The sound of it stayed with him long after she stopped speaking. He called the sheriff the next morning and told him quietly that there was something wrong, something beyond science. Her corneas had a structure he'd never seen, a crystalline pattern under magnification, as though layers of reflective cells had evolved to bend light in unnatural ways. They reacted like those of nocturnal creatures, capable of reflecting even the faintest glow, but far more complex. He wrote in his report that her eyes did not merely see light, they seemed to contain it. The sheriff asked if he thought it was genetic. The doctor hesitated before answering. He said softly that it wasn't mutation. It was preservation. Something ancient, carried forward through generations that should have never existed. And whatever it was still alive in her. 2 days after the doctor's unsettling report, the sheriff organized a small search party to comb through the land surrounding the cabin. The girl remained silent in her holding room, staring out the window as if she already knew what they were about to find. The woods were thick with fog that morning, the kind that muted sound and made every step echo strangely. As they pushed deeper through the brush, the smell of damp soil gave way to something sharper, a metallic tang that clung to the air like rust and decay. It was the deputy who spotted the first stone half buried under the roots of an oak. He brushed away the dirt and found a name carved into the surface, weathered and almost illegible. Then another, just a few feet away. And another after that. The sheriff ordered the men to clear the ground. What emerged from beneath the tangle of vines and fallen branches wasn't a single grave but an entire cemetery, small and unmarked on any county record. The stones were arranged in uneven rows, some no bigger than a loaf of bread, others tall and leaning, eaten by moss. All bore the same surname, etched crudely into the rock marrow. Some graves had dates carved in that overlapped in ways that made no sense, as if people had been born and died at the same time, or as if the same names had been reused over and over across decades. The oldest stones dated back more than 100 years, though a few looked recently disturbed, the earth still soft and unsettled. In the center of the clearing stood a stone cross, its surface cracked and pitted. Something had been tied to it, a length of frayed rope, a charm made of animal bones, and a strip of faded cloth that fluttered faintly in the cold wind. The sheriff picked it up and froze when he saw what was stitched into the fabric, a small embroidered eye, almost identical to the one carved into the child's wooden toy found inside the cabin. As they documented the graves, one of the men noticed something strange in the soil, a faint shimmer, like flecks of glass catching the light. When the sheriff knelt to inspect it, he realized it wasn't glass at all but fragments of bone, polished smooth as if by fire or years of handling. The deeper they dug, the more they found relics, trinkets, and bones buried together in ways that didn't follow any burial custom. Standing among the graves, the sheriff felt the air grow heavier, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. The silence pressed down on them until one man whispered that it didn't feel like a cemetery at all. It felt like a promise that had never been broken. The sheriff wasn't the only one shaken by what they'd uncovered. Word of the hidden graveyard spread through Waycross Hollow faster than wildfire, and those old enough to remember the Marrow name began locking their doors before sundown. But one man came forward, an aging farmer named Eli Turner, who lived just beyond the ridge, less than a mile from the woods. He claimed he remembered the Marrow family, or what was left of them, though his voice trembled when he spoke their name. He said they'd lived deep in the hollow when he was a boy, kept to themselves mostly, but strange things happened whenever they came into town. Livestock went missing, wells turned foul overnight, and once, a preacher's wife had gone mad after saying she'd seen the devil's reflection in a child's eyes. Eli said that child's name was Clara. The sheriff drove out to Eli's farmhouse the next morning. The man looked frail but sharp, his eyes restless. He told his story. He said the family had all died off years ago, at least that's what everyone believed. But one night, long after the supposed fire that destroyed their home, Eli had seen a light in the trees, faint and blue, moving slow through the mist. He'd gone out to look and saw a girl standing at the edge of the field. Barefoot. Still. Watching. He swore it was Clara, unchanged, just as she'd looked when he was a child. Her face hadn't aged a day. She only turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing like smoke. He tried to tell the townsfolk, but no one believed him. They said grief had made him see ghosts. But Eli insisted what he saw was flesh and blood, only not human in the way it should have been. When the sheriff asked if he thought the girl they'd found was the same one, Eli nodded slowly. He said she wasn't new to these woods. She'd been there before, many times, reborn through the same cursed bloodline. They never die, he whispered. They just change their faces. That night, the sheriff planned to bring Eli in for a formal statement, but he never got the chance. When a deputy went to fetch him the next morning, the farmhouse was empty. The front door was open, the lights still on, breakfast untouched on the table. Out back, in the soft dirt near the fence, were a set of footprints, small, bare, and leading straight toward the woods. After Eli Turner's disappearance, the search for answers became an obsession for the sheriff. The air in Waycross Hollow felt different, heavier, charged with something unseen, as if the woods themselves were aware of being disturbed. Determined to find the truth, the sheriff and his deputy returned to the old cabin, this time to tear it apart board by board if necessary. The place was colder than before, untouched since their last visit, but a faint, metallic smell lingered in the air. The sheriff noticed the uneven floorboards near the hearth and pried one loose. Beneath it was a small wooden chest, weathered and bound with a strip of leather that crumbled at his touch. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed pages tied together with twine, a journal, its first page marked only with the name Clara M. and the year 1894. The handwriting was uneven, slanted, and frantic, as if written by trembling hands. The earliest entries spoke of life in isolation, a family devoted to keeping their blood pure and their gift intact. The entries grew darker over time, describing a ritual meant to preserve the sight, an ability passed down through generations that allowed the chosen to see beyond the human world. The writer spoke of holy unions, of children born from the same blood to strengthen the gift, and of how the eyes of the chosen would shine with light untainted by the world outside. Each generation, it said, required sacrifice, a cleansing to renew the line. The words blurred near the edges where water or tears had stained the paper, but one phrase remained clear, * we do not die. We return, again and again, through the flesh of our own. *. Further in, the journal described nights of chanting, the mixing of blood, and offerings left beneath the old maple near the family cemetery. It detailed the creation of symbols, carvings in wood and bone meant to bind their souls within their own lineage. The writer claimed that outsiders who witnessed the rituals went mad or vanished, taken by the light they were never meant to see. The sheriff read in silence, each page heavier than the last. The final entry was dated almost 70 years ago and written in a rushed scrawl. It spoke of a child reborn whose eyes held all that was left of the family's power. The entry ended with a chilling line that looked as if it had been written in haste, smeared with something darker than ink. * She will return when the blood calls her home. She always does. * The sheriff closed the journal slowly, his reflection flickering in the window, and for just a second, another face seemed to look back. The sheriff couldn't shake the unease that followed him after finding the journal. Sleep came only in fragments, and when it did, his dreams were filled with the girl's eyes, luminous, endless, watching. He tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, that the mind plays cruel tricks when it's worn down. But late one night, as he sat in his office reading through the last of the journal's pages, something shifted in the air. The lamps flickered, dimmed for a heartbeat, and then steadied again. The girl sat silently in the holding cell across the room, knees drawn to her chest, staring into the glass of the window. Her reflection was faint in the darkened pane, yet when the sheriff looked closer, he thought he saw more than one image. He rose slowly, the old floor creaking beneath his boots. The journal lay open on his desk, the ink from the final entry bleeding slightly where his coffee had spilled earlier. The words seemed to pulse in the light. She will return when the blood calls her home. He stepped toward the window dividing him from the cell, his breath catching when the girl finally turned her head. For a moment, her eyes caught the lamplight, and he saw something inside them, not a reflection, not a trick of light, but movement. It was faint at first, like the shimmer of water on glass, then sharper. He saw faces. Dozens of them, layered and fading in and out of sight, men, women, children, all with the same haunting features, all staring back at him. They were whispering, their mouths moving in silent rhythm, and though no sound came through the glass, the sheriff swore he could hear their voices in his head, rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic chant. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, the journal falling from his hand and landing open on the floor. The girl stood now, her reflection multiplying in the glass as though she were more than one person, more than one time. She tilted her head, her expression unchanged, and placed her palm against the glass. The light from the lamp bent toward her touch, casting strange patterns across the walls. The sheriff tried to move, to look away, but his eyes locked onto hers. And in that instant, he understood what the doctor had meant, that her eyes didn't just contain light. They held memories, lives, generations of the same cursed blood staring out through one body. The girl blinked once, and all the faces vanished except one, his own, reflected back at him, pale and trembling, surrounded by the silent family watching from behind her gaze.